Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Dignan, and he's here to share with us his new book, Brave New Work. Are you ready to reinvent your organization? Now, Aaron is the founder of The Ready, which is an organization design and transformation firm that helps institutions like Johnson & Johnson, Charles Schwab, Microsoft, Citibank, and many more change the way they work. He is a co-founder of Responsive.org, an investor in purpose-driven startups, and as he says, a friend to misfit toys. So let's welcome to the show, Aaron Dignan.
Thank you for having me.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I mean, my goodness, it's really changing the way that people look at business.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. We've obviously been working in this space, trying to change organizations for years and years, but this was our first chance to kind of share that story with the broader world and see how people react to it.
Well, I'd love for you to share your story of how you got to the point where you're working, because I know you work with some of the biggest brands in the world. Like, how did you get to that point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I sort of see my professional journey as a little bit of just a series of questions being asked and sort of following the curiosity. And so, when I originally began working with clients, it was really more about brand and about, why do people have such irrational kind of emotional connections to some brands and not others? And what does that mean? And then after years of working on that question, I started to notice, hey, all the brands that are really changing culture and changing behavior are technology brands. And isn't that interesting? And what might that mean? And then spent, the better part of a decade working on digital disruption and technologies that, are changing culture, like 3D printing and robotics and machine intelligence and, everything you can imagine. And towards the end of that kind of, pattern of digging, I started to recognize, oh, wow, maybe it's not about the technologies at all. Maybe the reason this is so interesting is we're just not very good at changing our institutions. So whether that be for-profit, nonprofit, government, public institutions, we're just not that good at changing at scale. We're not very good at learning as organizations once we get past a certain age and a certain scale. And the bureaucracy that creeps in is really quite stifling. So what would it mean to work in a new way, something more adaptive, more human, more kind of lifelike? What would that look like? And so I went on a walkabout to study that and started The Ready about 4 years ago with the mission to kind of change how the world works, to really try to eradicate senseless bureaucracy and needless hierarchy and silos, and really get back to, a way of working that is more connected and is more intelligent.
Well, it seems that it's so hugely popular right now, especially because we have, when we look at the millennial generation, they're looking for something that has purpose, something that really will drive them. And so organizations and companies need to meet those needs.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think people want purpose as sort of a capital P purpose level in terms of the mission and meaning of the company itself. And they also want to be able to make meaning out of the work they do every day with their teams and with their colleagues. And, just what does it feel like to be at work? And I think for a lot of people, it feels like a place where you have to wear a mask of professionalism and where you have to kind of do what you're told. And, in many ways, for a lot of companies, it's a bit of a dictatorship. And I think that we want more. We crave something with more autonomy and more purpose and more connection to each other.
I think a lot of companies don't even know how to get from point A to point B. And I love how your book, you talk about that. So how can businesses identify what's holding them back, what isn't working, and ultimately what's completely sabotaging where they're at?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think about what we're facing at work as a kind of a debt. So, you know about financial debt where you borrow money and you pay interest on it. I think about organizational debt. So when we make choices or we avoid making choices that about processes, about rules, about structures, about roles we play, et cetera, and we either live with something too long that's no longer serving us, or we don't clarify something for too long that we really need clarity on, it's a kind of a debt, and we pay tax on it in the form of frustration and being slowed down and being held back from achieving our potential. So I think the first thing to recognize is just what we're doing. And it's, we're going to refactor that debt. We're going to, pay it off by focusing on how we work and focusing on what I call the organizational operating system. And so, the first step in that process, we think about it as a loop, a learning loop in the book. But the first step in that process is to identify tension. So the question I ask teams, it's really the only question you need, I think, is what's holding you back from doing the best work of your life? And if you ask that question to a team, they'll have an answer. They'll be like, oh, we have meetings to prepare for meetings, or we're working in silos and we're not talking to each other, or we don't really know what our priorities are, or we don't really know how to make decisions quickly and effectively. They'll tell you what it is that they think is top of mind that's holding things back. And once you've identified that tension at a team level, you can then start to play with, well, what should we do? What should we try? And that's where I enjoyed in the book kind of going and exploring all these different organizations on the fringes that work differently and decide differently and structure teams differently and pay differently, et cetera, because it gives us a broader palette to paint with. And then once we have a practice that we think might help, it's, nothing's going to solve it forever, but might help, then we can design kind of a safe to try experiment to go do and go be with that new practice and see like, wow, does that, do we feel like things are faster or better or different? And then if it does work and we are feeling that benefit, then can we scale it? Can we offer it to other teams? Can we make it something that's more of a norm about how we work? And that's really, that's at the heart of what we're proposing, is that very simple learning loop. What's holding you back? What are you willing to try? Where are you going to go try it? And then find out what happens.
Do you find with some companies that you work with, because I mean, you've got the biggest brands coming to you, that they sometimes are a little bit resistant for some of these changes?
Well, I think the resistance comes, not so much in the specific, but in the mindset. And we talk in the book about the difference between complicated and complex systems. And I think this is really at the heart of why we get stuck. Complicated systems are systems like watches or engines that have maybe a ton of parts that are, connected in different ways, but that fundamentally can be understood by an expert. You can go to school and learn how to repair a watch. You can predictably figure out what's going wrong and fix it. A problem in a complicated system can be solved. In a complex system is a different thing, right? That's like, traffic or weather or a garden or a 6-year-old. It is a fundamentally unpredictable thing, right? It has a way it's trending. It's dispositional. It has a way of showing you kind of where it's going. It looks like rain today, for example, but we can't say exactly when it's going to rain and exactly how much accurately until we get to the very moment of it happening. And so the problem, I think, that really exists within organizations of all sizes, by the way, is we tend to think of the organization as a machine, as a watch. And we're like, oh, we just need the right player in this role and the right leader to do this and the right strategy and the right plan. And once all those things are in place, then it's just going to work like clockwork. And the reality is like, no, it's a garden. Nobody ever comes in from the garden and says, honey, I fixed the garden, right? That's not how it works. You have to test and learn and prod and poke and try things and nurture and sort of be in relationship with it. And that means that the way we think about organizational change has to reflect that. And so when we get to some of these questions of what should we do and what should we try, the first thing that we have to deal with is let's remember that it's not a machine, that it's a living system. And then the second set of stuff that connects to mindset is really just about what do we believe about people? Are we fundamentally people negative or are we fundamentally people positive, right? Do we believe that people are worthy of trust and respect? Do we believe that they're motivated more by autonomy and mastery and purpose, as you said, or more by carrots and sticks? Do we believe they'll rise to the challenge or not? And what I find is that the leaders and teams that do have a people positive mindset have much better success with these efforts, and they just get different results. Like people show up differently when they're expected to show up differently. And people that are generally people negative, often aren't even willing to try, right? Because they fear and they suspect failure. And so they're not willing to take that risk. And I think that's the dividing line. It's not so much the practice as the way we perceive it.
That can really kind of squash any creativity and new ideas that would come up as well.
Well, yeah, it squashes everything, right? Because if essentially, if everyone comes into work and it's like, hey, we don't trust you, um, and we fundamentally
Yeah.
don't think you'll get better at your job without our help, it's very paternalistic, and I think it turns people off. And you see it, you see it in real time, and it's not hard to sort of see these assumptions about people as you walk around. You walk into a factory, and there's a punch clock where people punch in and out. Well, what does that say? Well, to me, it says we don't trust you to show up to work on time, and we don't trust you to bill us for an appropriate amount of your time. Well, if that's true, then and how sad is that? And what can we do to change that? And in many of the cases that I looked at in the book, including factories, they did, and the results are quite astounding.
Yeah, that's got to be such a when you have that mind shift change, and people are able to feel like they have value and purpose, and they're really appreciated. That's got to change everything within a business.
It does. I think it changes the way it feels, and it changes what it's capable of. One of the factories that I looked at in the book, there was a moment during a war where a recession kind of hit, and they didn't have enough capital to cover all their expenses. And in a traditional system, obviously the heads of the company would squirrel away in a room and then reveal a plan and fire people and do whatever they're going to do with their battle axe. In this case, the founder just stood up on a milk crate and said, "Hey, here's the situation. We don't have enough money. Here's how much. Here's what the gap is. Any ideas?" And the whole factory started to talk, and people chipped in different ideas, and fundamentally, they solved the problem through dialogue. One of the leaders there was like, "Hey, what if we got paid for 3 weeks instead of 4 for a few months, and that way everyone could stay, no one has to get fired, and we can kind of weather the storm." And people said, "All right," and they did that, and they did weather it, and they got out on the other end, and everybody was able to persist. So I think it changes the way we approach conflict, and it changes the way we approach opportunity as well.
I love how you have your book. It's very easy to read, even for there's lots of um, very new and interesting information in here, and some of it can be a little complex. You talk about the future of work, the operating system, and the change. And the operating system, there are a lot of different items that you have listed there. I'd love to have you share a few of them with us.
Yeah. So what we did is when we went out and looked at organizations that were known for being adaptive and agile and more human and just great places to work, we just said, what makes you different? And so they would say, oh, well, we meet differently, or we decide differently, or we structure teams differently, or we pay differently. And every time we heard one of those stories, we just wrote it down and kind of pinned it to the wall, so to speak. And what happened is they started to coalesce around these spaces. There are 12 in the book. And these spaces were like, oh, wow, this is where all that change is happening. This is where things are, becoming different most rapidly. So it's not a comprehensive list of like all the operational area. It's not a framework. It's just a mirror of a few spaces that seem to be in flux. And so it's things like purpose, as you mentioned, structure, authority, how we think about authority and what we do about authority and decision making, resource allocation, meetings. I mean, God, we could write a whole book and talk for an hour about meetings all by themselves. Mastery, how we learn and develop, membership, which is kind of how we think about what we're a part of and what we're not a part of, and what roles we hold in teams. So yeah, there were all these different areas that emerged, and each one gave us a chance to say, all right, well, what does the old way look like, and what does the new way look like?
I love that way people can really start looking at this, going, okay, where can we make some changes? But you also caution about, reading the book and coming in Monday morning and implementing a bunch of changes overnight.
Yeah, the funny thing about this work is, as you start to get excited about it, and I, by the way, am guilty of this as well in my last company. But you start to get excited about it, and the way then you want to implement it is the old way. So you're like, oh, I'm excited about all this freedom and self management. I'm going to go in on Monday and mandate that everyone do this, and which is counterintuitive. It would be like your last dictatorial action to make everyone take charge of themselves. But it's challenging. You have to wade into it and step into it, gently, and make sure that people that are coming at this from different perspectives have a chance to figure out what it means for them. Because for the people that have been the loudest voices and the kind of, the leaders and the ones making the calls, it can mean stepping back and changing your identity and your ego. in interesting ways that are, that last for years of practice. And for people that have been used to taking orders and stepping back and being kind of told what to do and being a quieter voice, it can be quite abrupt to be like, hey, we need to hear your voice now, and what you're going to do today is up to you. And that can all be very challenging as well. So there's a lot of acclimating that has to happen. And that means that rushing in and trying to like make this suddenly true is not always the best way to go.
How long do you feel that kind of transition on average could take?
I think it depends on the size of the group. But certainly, if you're talking about a group of, dozens or hundreds of people, it can be done in the space of a year. And the practice never ends, right? So there's a little bit of a weird thing where it's like, well, when are we doing it and when are we done? And the reality is you're never done, because what you're really buying into is a philosophy of continuous improvement. You're really buying into the idea of like, oh, we're going to work on the business and in the business all the time. And we're going to keep sensing our tension, and we're going to keep processing it and making this place better. And so we're never done. What we're really asking is, how long does it take for those mindsets to become second nature, and for those kinds of ways of perceiving the challenges the organization faces to be different? And so, yeah, I think in small groups that are really committed, it can happen quite quickly in months or a year or two. In really large systems of 100,000 or more people, like we often work with, that's a decade-long journey, I think.
Yeah, that's changing habits there in many ways.
For sure, and small countries worth of people, I mean, it's like how long would it take to change the American culture in some way, right? A long time.
Yeah, and as it continues to shift and go itself, and it's interesting. I think a lot of times when people, they hear this discussion and they see the book, they may think that this is only for like leaders or leadership, people in leadership, but that's not the case.
No, I think it certainly requires some measure of participation from leaders and some measure of awareness, because at the end of the day, if everybody that holds power in a system doesn't want that system to change, it's going to be a long road. But most teams have a kind of a learned helplessness about what they can actually change. And the reality is when we sit with them and we kind of ask the 5 whys and dig a little deeper, it's like they can actually change a lot about the way they work, the way they meet, the way they talk, the way they decide, treat each other, think about strategy, et cetera. They have quite a bit of leeway. And so, regardless of who you are, even if you're a solo practitioner, I think you can be thinking more deliberately about how do we work? What do we believe about work and how to get it done, and what kind of a culture we want to build, and how we want to show up in that system. And even if even if the only person you can change is you, that can be quite profound if you start showing up differently and thinking differently and proposing things and asking these questions. Something I always advise individuals to do that come up to me after talks and speeches and say, hey, what can I do? And, the first thing I jokingly say is, why don't you surreptitiously put a copy of the book on your boss's chair?
I was just going to say that.
Say who it's from. But the second thing is just ask the question that the book poses in the beginning. What's stopping us from doing the best work of our lives? Like, say that out loud in a meeting and see what people say. I mean, what a powerful question. And I'm always curious to see how that gets, what conversation that begins.
But, leaving this book on people's chairs in the C-suite is not a bad idea either. So.
Yeah, exactly. It's guerrilla warfare, in the form of, hey, you might want to consider this, take a look at this. What's funny is I find that even leaders that people tell me are going to be challenging, when they read it or when they engage with these ideas, they get it. I think in many cases when we're in leadership positions, particularly in established companies, we're just part of that system, and all that org debt and all those policies and procedures and structures are kind of holding us back. And so even though we may be behaving in a certain way, it's not our native identity. It's just how we're acclimating to that system. There's a lot more openness out there than I think people believe there is. And once we stop being victims to the broader system, I think we can do quite a bit.
In your book, you talk about the looping process, and I'd love for you to share with our listeners what that is and why that's important.
Yeah, so this is what I was getting at earlier about tension, practice, experiment. It's just that it is just that learning loop of, hey, what's a tension that we're dealing with that's holding us back. And we have a deck of tension cards that we use with clients and partners. The content of which is in the book, but we sort of put these cards in front of people and say, is it this? Is it that? Is it, like where does it hurt? Or where do we feel like we're leaving opportunity on the table? And just having teams discuss and debate that is really interesting. You get different perspectives, like this is happening or that is happening. Maybe this pocket of the organization feels like it has low trust and another pocket feels like they have really high trust. So it helps us to think about this as a system with a lot of diverse realities. And then from there, in considering what we can try and then going and trying it. It's really as simple as that. And I think at some level, what we're really teaching clients to do when we work with them is not necessarily to work in any particular new way, but it's just to do that looping process, just to be in that learning loop of what are we feeling now? What are we sensing? What are we going to try? And then how will we look back and decide what to do based on what happens and what we learn?
What was some of the most interesting research that you discovered while you were writing this book?
Well, I think a couple of things. One was just how broad this movement is. So even though it's less than 0.1% of all companies in the world, I would say, that are really working in this new way, you can find an example in almost every category. I mean, we looked at an auto parts manufacturer, a healthcare company, a bank, military organizations, convenience stores. Like it's just amazing to me how broad the categories really are. It's not like this is a technology thing or a Silicon Valley thing or a European, cooperative thing. Like this is happening in almost every country and almost every category, but it's happening on the fringes. So that really stood out to me. And then just the sheer, capacity of people to solve problems in new ways. There's one organization we looked at where people set their own salaries and write their own job descriptions every year and just use an advice process to calibrate that. And it works. And they have like 10x the profit of their competition. So just stories like that where you're like, damn. Or, a bank that does 20 billion in annual, turnover and has essentially abandoned the normal budgeting process, like just doesn't do traditional annual budgeting. So things like that really blew my hair back.
I could imagine. That would make it interesting to see what kind of, profit and loss they have if they don't have their budgeting in place.
Yeah, well, they've beaten the average of all European banks for 40 years in a row in terms of profit over revenue.
Well, there you go. I guess that says it. And with all the companies that you've consulted with and helped them, implement, reinvention and change, what has been your biggest challenge?
I think the challenge that usually gets us, and it's one that is easy to overcome but hard to navigate if you're not the one making the change, is just making time. People, because of the nature of the way we work and our pace and our urgency and our intensity about growth and quarterly earnings and all that kind of thing, people are packed. Their days are back to back to back to back to back. When they end one project, they're already starting another one. There's just no space to think and to reflect and to make change happen. And so often when we talk about it, people are like, hey, it sounds great. I'm so on board. And then when it's like, cool, can you make an hour to do the work? I don't know if I can make an hour to do that. And this comic that I always refer to, that I just love is, so this couple of folks are pushing a cart up a hill with square wheels on the cart. So it's quite difficult. And someone's offering them a round wheel and they're like, yeah, I don't have time for that. Like, we don't have time to switch to the round wheel. We got to push this square wheeled cart up the hill. And that's, to me, the lived experience of that resistance is like, we can't make time to work in new and better ways because we're working in old ways that are really, hampering us. And I think that's the big thing. And the teams that are very successful are the ones that are just like, this is the most important thing. Like, we're going to get better at the way we work together at the expense of everything else. And they do. And hilariously, they also hit their targets.
Well, that's, and that's what businesses look for. It's like, okay, can we make these changes and still hit the marks that we're needing to hit? And it can be done.
It can, yeah. But it's one of those things where the counterintuitive part is you have to give up on the target for a second to make the change. And in so doing, you also get the target. But you can't hold them both, right? You can't keep married to the idea that we're going to hit the plan. That has to take second fiddle to, if we change the way we work now, we get that dividend forever. And I always talk to teams about the compound interest of learning. Like, if you get 1% better per week, at the end of the year, you're going to be just demonstrably better than your competition. But you got to make space for that 1%.
Yeah, that's, it's just kind of having a new perspective when you look at this, because it's that whole, I love that analogy with the square wheel, and, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it is kind of like pushing that uphill,
Yeah. Well, and it just goes back to the idea of, like, if it's a complicated system and it's a watch and we have a plan that we have to hit, then we're fighting nature. And so, of course, that takes all of our energy and focus. But if we step back and realize, oh, this is actually an emergent thing and all sorts of, possibilities could play out here, then you can kind of step into it with a little bit more openness.
So during this entire process, what is the role of a leader?
Yeah, so I think, in the past, the role of the leader obviously was to ensure perfect execution, essentially, right? Like, your job is to make sure things go according to plan. In the future, in a world where we recognize complexity and we recognize the dynamism of markets and teams, your job is to ensure continually growing capability and capacity. And that means allowing people to learn and to try and to fail, and, essentially letting the muscle of the organization grow. So we often talk about the job, especially in this change, as kind of creating and holding space for whatever needs to happen. And creating that space means saying, like, hey, there's an opportunity here, there's a purpose, there's a mission, there's a project that we need to do. And so now you've created some space for people to fill. And then once they fill it, protecting that space and saying, all right, this is going to be a place where we can all feel safe, where we can be honest with each other, where we can, make the time to do it right. And we're not going to let the kind of muscle memory of this old bureaucracy encroach and screw up our space. We're going to actually let the space be sacred and basically, create the space to do the best work of our lives together. And I think that's a very different role. And some do it really well intuitively, and others have to practice into that. But it is, that's the job now.
You have a whole new idea for how that's supposed to work, but it works, and I love how you have this all brought together. Brave New Work is just a great read. Where can our listeners connect with you, Aaron, and be part of your community and learn more about the work that you do?
Yeah, so a few ideas. The book obviously has a site at bravenewwork.com, so there's some info there. I highly recommend signing up for the Brave New Work newsletter. We send a once a week, digest out with all the different articles and concepts that are floating around the world of work design. So something like 5,000 or 6,000 people get that now and enjoy it every week. And then I'm on Twitter. I don't really do much other social media, LinkedIn a little bit, but mostly Twitter. So if you want to get a conversation going, just at Aaron Dignan and tell me what you're thinking about.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot, Marianne.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Brave New Work. Brave New Work's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. We're going to pause here for a quick break. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, When you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place, here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
If not me, then who? This ethos is driving the Travis Manion Foundation to empower veterans and families of fallen heroes to develop character in future generations. In 2007, Marine First Lieutenant Travis Manion was killed in Iraq while saving his wounded teammates. Travis's legacy lives on in the 5 words he spoke before leaving for his final deployment. If not me, then who? Guided by this mantra, veterans continue their service, developing strong relationships in the community, and thrive in their post-military lives. Visit TravisManion.org and ensure the character of our nation's heroes lives on in the next generation. If not me, then who?
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our next special guest, Dr. Hayim Heron, and he's here to share with us his new book, Connecting Generations, Bridging the Boomers, Gen X, and the Millennial Divide. Now, Hayim is an author, presenter, and a nonprofit organizational futurist with a specialty in faith-based communities. A former congressional rabbi and C-suite nonprofit executive, Hayim blends original research and real-world experience to inspire individuals and organizations to achieve their greatest impact. He's a proven organizational visionary and entrepreneur and works to create today's leaders for tomorrow's organizations. So let's welcome to the show, Dr. Hayim Heron.
Thanks so much for having me, Marianne.
What a pleasure it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I think this is something everyone needs to have.
Well, I'm a little biased, but I agree with you because I found that conversations about intergenerational discussions or the lack of them have seemed to gravitate toward me over the past couple of years.
Was that the inspiration behind writing this book?
That was certainly one strand that created this tapestry, but another was just reading so many reports on the increase of social isolation, and most alarmingly, among our very young.
So how long did it take for you to do the research for this book?
I don't recommend this, but from start to finish, I wrote the manuscript, including the research and 150 plus studies, books, videos, and about 30 interviews in 1 year and 1 day.
Oh, wow. That's very ambitious, especially because
it's just a little crazy because I was not connected to anything but to my computer and to my interview subjects.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's so much detail and, studies and information in Connecting Generations. I am actually shocked that it took you that period of time. I expected it would take like years.
Well, I think that you're really addressing the sense of urgency that I felt because once the idea took shape, I felt just almost obsessed or compelled to complete this because it was so time sensitive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's so right. I mean, there have been many reports that talk about this time in history where we're really in this epidemic of loneliness. Why don't you expand on that for our listeners?
Yeah, so loneliness was something that we used to identify more with those who were elderly for understandable reasons. A person's world contracts, their autonomy diminishes. But, and here I don't want to blame everything on technology, because if it were that simple, it would be very easy to find a number of solutions. But for a number of different reasons, including technology, what became very clear in study after study was that social isolation is afflicting those who are teens and younger. And when you extrapolate I don't know how one quantifies the pain that young people are in, but also the health conditions, the negative health conditions that result from isolation, obesity, heart conditions, diabetes, and you extrapolate that out over decades, there's also a social, economic, and societal impact as well. And we can do something about that.
Well, I think it's encouraging to hear that that's something that we can remedy, because a lot of people, you do hear, we're going through these periods where people are just feeling really disconnected.
Yes, and perhaps in a kind of odd way, one of the things that I had heard and then really had a chance to study and listen to people is that throughout our lives, and I don't think this is really generation specific, we experience greater and lesser periods of dependence and independence. So one of the connective tissues across generations is the fact that we're all experiencing different kinds of disruption and feeling a little bit like just when we seem to have found our feet on firm footing, the tectonic plates shift again.
So why don't you share with us, what are some of the stereotypes that people have in regards to the different generations?
I will, and I'd like to focus on boomers and millennials, but you can pretty much pick your generation and find a, parallel and some additional stereotypes. So one of the joys of researching and really speaking with people, not just reading glossy reports, is I was able to ask boomers and millennials the same questions and to ask them their perceptions of one another. When I asked millennials what word or words came to mind when they heard the word boomer, they said work obsessed, goal driven, tough and tenacious, entitled, interestingly enough, and why work at a job that requires you to develop a bucket list when you can enjoy life along the journey. When I ask boomers, when you hear the word or words millennials, what images come to mind? Their response was, well, they're pleasure seekers, they're apathetic, they're snowflakes, which I find pretty demeaning, meaning they have no grit, they're delicate, they think they're unique, and they're also entitled. And these stereotypes really get in the way of the mutual learning that could be an alternative way to relating with one another.
That's truly unfortunate, because when you look at, just how one generation views the other, it doesn't seem that they're really communicating with each other well.
That's correct. And some have said, haven't we always had a generation gap? And yes, we could probably go back to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who talks about the decline of generations, but I don't think we're having a garden variety generation gap with 6 generations. And I actually think that there are 7 generations alive today, because the generation under the youngest generation, the Gen Zers, doesn't quite have a firm name yet. It may be Gen Alpha, but we don't have a template for having 7 generations alive at one time in proximity with one another. And that is a big difference.
That's just really astounding. So how does technology play a part in all of this?
Technology is a neutral platform, every pun intended. And like anything else, it can be used to either create generational barriers or generational bridges. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Technology has always been around and an issue. So when the first television entered neighborhoods, and then there were 3 channels and then many channels, and now we've kind of migrated from a large radio or television to a smartwatch or even a chip implanted into our fingertip. Technology, in that sense, its availability is not new. What is new is 24/7 connectedness. And as a result, some people, especially those who have not known a world without technology, almost seem to be retreating further and further inside of their devices instead of making eye contact with one another, having conversations, and understanding that the words that you say can make a difference in someone's life.
So on that note, when we talk about conflict at work with the different generations, what are some ideas or ways that people can resolve those and work more productively?
Yes, and of course, there's a trade-off involved for those who are in management or leadership positions. They have to weigh the cost of investing in healthier communications and effective communications, which means time and training, as opposed to keeping people on the job. My response to that is, if you invest a little upfront, there'll be a big payoff at the back end. And here are a few examples. What would you prefer? A flying chain of emails with a coworker in an office next door when you could have gotten up and resolved an issue in about 60 seconds, or misunderstandings, confusion about what was said and what was meant, and having to meet face-to-face anyway to resolve things? Another example. Each generation has different communication styles. And I think one of the better investments that leaders can make is helping individuals of different generations expand their repertoire of communication styles. So yes, you do have to know how to speak in emoji. They're like hieroglyphics for those who are not accustomed to them.
They are.
I actually think they are. At least, it's great. They convey feeling, ideas, but if you misuse them or misinterpret them, it can be a little risky. And for those who are younger, who only, let's just say they have nimble thumbs and maybe clumsy emotional intelligence, the investment is conversation and not being so concerned if words that come out of a person's mouth are a little bit messy. It's okay. You can clean them up. Mm-hmm. So very important to make that investment. And I would say especially Gen Xers who had to quickly migrate to technology, but can vaguely remember a world pre-technology, they're in leadership roles right now. And a great investment would be in their leadership development around communications.
It seems that if some of the younger generations had that as a resource, it would be so helpful because they don't remember a world without the iPhone or the computer where we actually had to go and communicate with one another.
That's right. When we speak about chips, I remember as a younger boomer growing up, the expression having a chip on your shoulder. Well, now it's like you have a chip in your shoulder. And that's not just cute. It's actually very telling about the profound differences that exist between those who are a little older and those who are a little younger.
Are there any type of resources for family members of different generations to kind of help them with these challenges and life transitions?
Yes, and one of the things that I included in my book, at the end of each chapter, there are action steps for individuals, families, and communities to take. one of the appendices that I have is the Family Action Technology Plan, which is designed to help families, although I think there's some wisdom that the person who contributed that, I think that wisdom can be applied to other settings, but how families can learn how to navigate the world of technology. And it's not just parents with young children or with teens, but it's also grandparents, because grandparenting has to be different today because those who are grandparents only had the television or radio to contend with and not all of these other technologies. In addition, I have another resource in the book that really helps families think about conversations, what I call replacing just-in-time conversations, meaning who wants to have a conversation in the time of an emergency, of a health crisis, for example. So readers can find a healthcare transition discussion guide, which is meant to help family members and caregivers and those who are involved with other families have discussions in advance about values, what matters to them, so that there's the leisure needed to really think through decisions not under duress.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I thought that your Family Technology Action Plan was a great resource for people to at least start the discussion on, how do we start having these bolder conversations?
Thank you. And that's why I sought out an expert to help me with that, because it is an area of expertise.
So when we talk about work, because there's so much that happens at work, we've got people of all different generations that are coming together in one place and expected to communicate very well with one another. I think a lot of it is very helpful if we understand what's important for each of the generations. And I'd love for you to kind of share that with us.
Yes, and I'm really glad that you brought that point up, because I think what you just described, trying to understand the influences that shape different generations, can help replace that kind of harsh judgment with a little bit more curiosity. So, for example, when we think of boomers and millennials, and I want to get back to that word entitled, because each of them in my interviews accuse the other of feeling entitled. So for a millennial, when a millennial says that a boomer feels entitled, that millennial means that just because of a person's seniority, experience, title, that no longer means that that person should assume leadership of a project or even a greater transition in an organization. When a boomer speaks about millennials being entitled, their feeling is, why do they think that they should be CEO on their second day of work? I put in X number of years and I slaved for bosses who were not very friendly, and they just have to, suck it up, grit their teeth, and do what I did. Well, both responses are a guaranteed recipe for a failure of conversation, because each generation has already made up its mind that the other wants to jockey for leadership and is entitled. When it comes to Gen Xers, again, I really think that they're an underutilized bridging generation. And yes, they are really good with technology. They're very savvy, but they also can help, I would say, those who are younger and older be open to what one of my colleagues calls reciprocal mentoring, understanding that a millennial may be much faster using a smartphone or a smartwatch, but that millennial can't Google qualities like resilience, empathy, and tenacity. At the same time, can a boomer let go just a little bit and accept that because of certain transformative experiences, a millennial may be better suited to assume greater responsibility on a project? And that takes security, a sense of security across the generations.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at maybe marketing towards a younger audience, having the resources of a millennial definitely would be a great resource, but we also have to temper that. And so I could see where both have such great qualities that just need to be recognized.
Yes, and again, I think it's important to emphasize a both and instead of an either or approach. So everybody predicted the demise of books in print, and now print books and digital books. I believe that print books may have surpassed for the first time in several years, or over the past several years, a number of digital editions of books. When it comes to other technologies, yes, it's really helpful to know how to use technologies that enable people to create, to innovate, and also to communicate more effectively and more rapidly, because sometimes you need that. Then, of course, there are times when it's important to be able to remain focused and not be distracted. Multitasking is a terrible myth, and I think that boomers can help younger people reclaim the art of what I've called unitasking, like we used to do. Spend more time, or less time, but more deeply on one task than fragmenting your imagination, your creativity, and your focus by deluding yourself into thinking that you can do lots of things well at one time.
Yeah. And I think science has proven that it's kind of like task switching is, I think, what they call it, because there's no real way that someone's effectively doing multiple things at once.
Yes, and that to me is a good example of how scientific data can help us remember, and that's why I'm still hopeful. Those who still remember the time before we had the pervasiveness of technology, that we can change what we created. It doesn't mean going back to the way things were, but what it means is now recalibrating old and new, not getting rid of one technology all the time in favor of another, but learning how to take advantage of a broader array.
I agree with you. I think there needs to be a new norm where there's a balance between them both.
Yes, and I think that's where it gets a little frightening and complicated, because a new norm suggests that things will eventually somehow balance themselves out, or with a little bit of intervention, we can think that through. But what happens when we're living in a time of accelerated exponential change, and the new norm is disruption? That's why I felt an urgency for writing this book, because that is the norm for the foreseeable future. And I think the best navigational tool that we have is helping one another across the generations live in this world today.
So what are some ways, because we have millennials and Gen X's that have baby boomers as parents and grandparents. How can we start having discussions in regards to some of the things that we really need to be paying attention to, like driving and just making sure that, as they age, that they're in safe surroundings?
That is, again, one of those things that it's really frightening to have to learn as you go. I think part of it is recognizing that we don't have a lot of experience in having people who are 90 plus who believe that they can still drive and want to live on their own. At the same time, because of the economy, we also have people, millennials, those who are younger, who may need to be living in the home of a parent or grandparent a little bit longer. So a couple things that people can do. Those who have some more time, boomers, Gen Xers, become a mentor. And to someone younger, if you're not sure how to do that, There are wonderful volunteer resources in people's communities, websites that I list in my book, where people can learn how to volunteer and to become a mentor. I would also say, based on the interviews that I've had with some really exceptional millennials, many volunteer for Special Olympics, have done Teach for America. Now, they have a sense of civic pride, but they often volunteer only with those who are their own age. Can they connect with someone who is a little bit older to work on a project on a limited basis, just to break down those stereotypes? Take a course online, or listen to some talks online. If you're older, understand that education is not black and white anymore for those who are younger. They have to balance the cost of college tuition and a degree with a debt that they're incurring in an uncertain economy. So I think it's having the courage to get out of where you are right now, what you're accustomed to. And if you can't do it alone, then ask a friend who already is involved in some cause that's of interest to you.
That's so important, and that would really help people with that whole, and we kind of come full circle with the whole loneliness epidemic, being able to connect with other people, either do some volunteering or just getting out in outside their social, their normal social circles.
Yes, and I learned one other very simple trick that I convinced myself might work, and it has. About 2 years ago, I was really getting concerned, and my concerns are heightened, just about the state of conversation in our families, neighborhoods, and communities. And I decided to try saying hello to people who might pass by in my office, maybe mumbled, good morning, but I didn't know their name, and I saw them frequently. I stopped somebody and said, I'm tired of just giving you an anonymous hello. I'd like to know your name. And my name is Hayim. It's been really tremendously fun. Take a little risk. It doesn't take an act of Congress to extend a hand to someone and just say hello. And from that, I've made a number of new friends. Otherwise, I don't think they would have been in my orbit of friends.
And it really, gosh, that took like no effort just to stop them and say, what's your name? We see each other all the time. I'd love to know who you are. Just to kind of make that personal connection.
Yes, it's a first step that may lead nowhere or may lead to an enriching relationship, but I'm no longer quite so risk averse when it comes to doing what comes naturally, saying hello by name.
And it's such an easy thing for anybody to start to do. It's not like you have to worry about what are you going to say next, or what are they going to think of you? It's just easy saying hello. Hi, my name's Marianne. What's your name? We pass each other all the time.
It's been very rewarding, and I've only gotten thank yous for just breaking the ice.
I'm sure you're going to get a lot more. Well, and what final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with today?
I think really what I said a moment ago, don't wait for somebody else or some entity to act for you when there are things that you can do to make small changes that can have multiplier effects. It can be pretty contagious in a good way when people who are strangers suddenly get to know one another, and other people in the workplace see, oh, I can actually maybe make an acquaintance at work, and I don't have to go through HR in order to do that. Now, certainly, I think it's gotten a little more confusing today about what is and what is not acceptable to say in the workplace, but I think that replacing judgment with curiosity, if somebody says something that is questionable or even hurtful, to be able to take a step back and say, I'd like to understand where is that feeling or thought coming from? It's usually based in a different experience, and that gets us back to where we began, with breaking down stereotypes and understanding everybody's experience across generations is just a little bit different, but that doesn't have to divide us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely been my experience when someone says something that can come across kind of rude or harsh. A lot of times they never even know that that's how it came across. They think that maybe I'm in work mode or I'm just being clear. So asking those questions, I think, really help to have that dialogue start.
I'm in full agreement with you. And I try to practice it and remember it. And if I don't get it right all the time, it's a goal to work toward.
Hey, I get it. I make a lot of mistakes too, so. Where can people connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about connecting generations?
Please visit www.hayimherring, HayimHerring.com. I'm available at hayimherring.com. My number is 612-859-1650 if anyone would like to begin a conversation.
Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Marianne, thank you. It was really a delight.
Well, thank you, Hayim. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Connecting Generations. Connecting Generations is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. If you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.